the SAP Finance Journey at Sony Music. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. We are here in New Jersey. I'm very pleased to be joined by Dave Cornine, who's Vice President, Information Systems and Technology for Global Financial Systems at Sony Music Entertainment. My name is Dan French. I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. Many of you know us and have interacted with us in the past, and many of you are clients also. Just a few words about us supporting our clients on this world-class finance journey. You recognize some of these names. We're going to hear from Sony Music today, and we work with organizations in Europe, North America, and even as far afield as South America and Asia. And today's session is really to listen to and understand the SAP Finance Journey at Sony Music. So this is our agenda. I'm going to give a brief introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about world-class finance and the challenge and the progress that we've made generally. Dave is then going to lead us on a narrative around the Sony Music experience. And I'm going to come back through with some lessons learned and some thoughts for the road for any of you considering similar activities. And then we'll have a Q&A. Now, as we go through this, please submit questions as we go through. There is a panel on the interface on this webcast for you to submit questions, and we'll pick those up at the end. Any of those we don't have time for or time to answer today, we'll answer by email directly. If you've got any technical issues, then please use the same interface, and one of our team will help you. So, as I say, thanks for joining us, and we'll get started. So, world-class finance, what's all that about? Our view of world-class finance as a state organizations are trying to achieve is a combination of several factors. One is we're trying to support the business achieve better business results at the top line, and of course at the bottom line also we want to reduce the cost of finance, and everyone's pushing that hard. 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, the cost of finance for most organizations are running from 2 to 3% of revenue, and now we're seeing best in class running at 1% and even down to nearly 0.7% of revenue, which is an amazing achievement. Obviously, optimizing cash flow is a key thing to help drive the business, and managing risk is critical. So these are the four key themes we see in organizations driving for world-class finance. And in terms of thinking about this journey, the continuous improvement we've seen, and it's been going on for some time, everyone sees the progress in driving costs down, but it's not enough just to reduce the cost. It's also about improving effectiveness. And this chart from KPMG is very helpful to kind of indicate the challenges we've had as we've improved our processes. Clearly, financial operations, the factory processes of finance, we've driven the cost down of those through standardization, simplification, shared services and outsourcing, and automation, clearly. We see cost of financial controls being reduced through optimization. Obviously, Sarbanes-Oxley effect was significant in the 2000s, but we've certainly addressed a lot of that. And there's a growing focus on how do we make the finance function help drive financial performance and better risk management. So you see that balance today, or certainly moving towards 2020, looking at different kind of segmentation than we did even 10 years ago. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at the breakdown of costs. And if we think about the world-class finance, what do leading organizations identify as the pillars for success? And I like this chart. It's simple, and it gives us something to hang initiatives on. Efficiency, we know what that is. It's trying to improve processes, speed and quality, and cut the cost. But effectiveness in parallel is about doing the right things, improving financial stewardship, and improving risk management. Relevance, helping provide the analytical support that the business needs to operate and to drive the results we need. And influence, which is about better business partnering for better outcomes for the business. So those are kind of thoughts for us. But what I'd like to do now is lead into the SAP Finance Journey at Sony Music. We're looking forward to this. The topics we're going to cover, I'm going to introduce Dave and ask him to share a bit about his experience. We're going to talk a little bit about Sony Music as a business, the SAP Finance Journey and ERP history, what's really drove the change in the recent initiatives, the issues about stakeholders, and then we're going to learn a little bit what was actually achieved, what have we learned. I will first just say welcome, Dave.
Hello, thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you and I are of a similar vintage.
Yes, I've been here for far too long, and with the company as it has evolved over the years from RCA Records to BMG Music to Sony BMG and now Sony Music, and I've been in different roles within the IT organization, always in IT, and for about the last 10 years I've been responsible for the global financial systems.
Great. And tell us a little bit about Sony Music, the business. You're a significant player in this world.
So Sony Music is one of the remaining major music companies, and we operate in these various countries around the world, 43 countries. Our primary business is a sale of recorded music, and we try to find new talent and develop them and market them in different markets around the world. In these markets, we try to find new artists, new talents that are local, as well as selling our artists and our products throughout all countries that have that desire for that market. Our revenues now, and we'll touch on this in a little bit, our revenues are about $3 billion, a little less than $3 billion. And as I mentioned before, at one point we were a joint venture between Sony Music and BMG Music, and our combined revenues were probably twice as much as where we are today. So it's been one of the challenges that we've seen in this industry has been the decline of revenue associated with recorded music and trying to find new markets that we can grow.
That's a very consistent experience with many businesses. You're trying to, as products and services get commoditized and pricing gets pushed down, how to respond to that. So we'll hear a little bit more about that. And of course, Sony Music isn't just the obvious, is it?
Yes, it's as I mentioned, its main focus for a very long time had been on the development of artists. So if we could find new talent in different markets and record them and package and market them and sell them, that was the goal. With the decline of revenue, we had to find other revenue streams. So Sony Music does have a very large catalog. We'll touch on some of the artists, but so we're able to continue to sell I'll call it the classic or legacy artists. And in addition to that, we try to find new ways to discover new artists. And so we have a relationship with the Simon Cowell franchise, so things like X Factor. We originally had American Idol, and those represented new avenues, I would say, to find new artists that we could sign and record. And we've also, this has been a change in the industry. Historically, the artists made their money on the sale of the recorded music, but also made a lot of money on merchandise, on concerts and different programs. And as we go forward, we try to sign the additional rights so that the company, Sony Music, can also share in some of the revenues that the artists bring in as a result of these ancillary income streams.
There's a broad base of business there. So,
and this is just an example of all of the artists that we have. A lot of old, a lot of new. Again, we've been around for over 100 years, and the internet, the digital distribution has made the sale of a lot of the catalog artists much more popular. But we have to constantly find new artists to replace the artists as they move on, and it's a big goal and a big challenge of the industry in general. But this is a good example of many of the artists that we have here.
Yeah, and it's a sad coincidence. As I was standing outside this conference room looking at a wall of the talent, and obviously in the middle there's a photograph of David Bowie who died on Sunday, very sadly. So, yeah. So Tell us a little bit about this SAP Finance Journey, a bit of the history, and what really drove the change. Why did you need to do this?
So I'd say that the main driver for the change was the cost savings that we needed to achieve. Since roughly about the year 2001, the industry really changed, and that coincided with the decline of the physical market, so CDs, and the U.S. market really crashed. We were suffering from deep drops in the revenue associated with physical products, so we had to really adjust our cost basis with the same decline, and for a long time, I'd say probably close to 10 years, we were going through 10% reductions of our operating expense. And I would say within the IT organization, we did the typical things where you reduced your staff. We also moved offshore with a lot of the support for SAP. And we did that for a number of years, and then we really reached a point where there was no more water to squeeze out of the stone, and we had to look at something different. So we looked at our environments and looked at the total cost of running these environments and concluded that by consolidating and standardizing our SAP environment, we could achieve significant savings and put us in a better position going forward. So we built a business case. We worked with various partners and integrators, and we built a business case around what it would take to, I'll say, redo our SAP implementation and follow a standard practice and establish the global template. As a result of that investment and the projected savings, we received approval to go forward with this project, and I'll touch on that in the subsequent slides.
Yeah, so this business case, it was pretty significant, putting this together?
Yeah, so one thing I have to add is we run SAP for the financial accounting processes, so it's a relatively small footprint. It's really around FI, and we have a lot of the other, I'd say, business processes that most companies would have with our sales, our distribution, particularly in the digital sales area, but we use non-SAP applications. Very often these are custom developed solutions for royalties, for physical distribution, and it requires us to have a lot of interfaces that we bring into SAP. So we're running SAP for financial purposes, and at the time we had very different configurations of SAP and virtually very little standardization. So as part of building the business case, we had to then talk to our stakeholders in finance in the various countries. At the time, we had 10 countries in SAP when we started this project, and we started this project in 2012. So we had 10 different countries in various instances of SAP, and we then went back and looked at how they operated, and then tried to find whatever common links that we could establish, and then convince them of the benefits of standardizing and establishing a global template that we could go forward on, and migrate those countries into this new instance.
How did you bring together those stakeholders, and who were the key stakeholders in this process?
The key stakeholders were the financial directors in each of the major countries that we operated. The countries that participated in the initial analysis in the business case were the U.S., Canada, UK, and Germany and France. That group of countries represents probably 75% of our revenue within Sony Music, so they were the big stakeholders and had the most influence. We brought them together and listened to try to understand how they were using SAP, try to find out what was different or common or unique to each environment, and then try to come up with a straw man approach to say, will this operate? Will this work for you in this environment? And ultimately, we got agreement and sign off from all of those countries on the template that we established. And this was unique because we really did not have any kind of different chart of accounts. We had different dimensions within each instance, and even in the same instances where we had multiple countries, they were configured very differently. And this was really as a result of the initial implementations that took place probably 15 years ago when the industry was stronger, when the egos were stronger and more powerful, and you could get away with saying this is the way I do it in my country. And that all changed with the decline of the revenue, and people had to get on board with, I'll say, corporate initiatives to reduce cost and to gain efficiencies through standardization.
I guess it's difficult to deal with for people running an individual market to sometimes understand the importance of standardization across the globe.
Right, and I'd say the way we operate as a company, it's very decentralized, even though there's the common goals. Each country is really operating in their market as an individual entity with its own P&L, so they look out for their interests, but at the same time they do have the corporate interest, and trying to find that balance of doing what's right for the company was tricky. And again, I think one of the big challenges we faced here was, in many ways, a lot of these countries had been operating in their version of SAP for probably 10 years, so they were very accustomed to what they had and also didn't know any differently. They were just used to what they had in place at the time.
So tell us a little bit more about this journey then with SAP.
So this slide really represented what we looked like in 2012. We had different financial accounting systems. We had SAP in our major countries, and at the time we also had a strategy of large companies that were over a certain revenue threshold would go into SAP. Smaller countries would go into Microsoft Navision, which we used in the Latin region and parts of Europe. Asia at the time was still running J.D. Edwards, and then we had a couple of, I'll call them renegade systems, where we had Turkey, Greece, Russia were running their own completely local system. So we took a look at this landscape, realized that it was very complicated and expensive. In some places where it's configured different, if we had to make a change for an interface, we'd have to make that interface change many times because each of these instances were so different. And this one slide under SAP kind of gives a feel for the differences in the instances. At the time, we had 4 individual instances, one for the US, one for Canada, one for Europe, which consisted of the UK, Germany, and so forth. And we also had a separate one that was used for a digital process at the time. But within each of these instances, configurations were very different and the dimensions were very different. And that just created a lot of inefficiencies when you have to support them, when you have to develop interfaces and
different chart of accounts,
all of that was very difficult to gain any synergies. I think one of the things that was happening at the time, which also helped us, was that the business, the financial accounting operations, were also tasked with moving to a back office shared services operation. And I think so there were a lot of challenges with that, and that also highlighted the inefficiencies in our environment. So now you've got centralized accounting processes in, say, India and Romania, but within those organizations, we had to have separate teams to support each country. So there was a loss of efficiency because of the way our systems were configured and the way our processes were handled.
I guess it makes it much clearer then to the stakeholders the difference in cost of having a non-standard process.
Right. And we'll touch on some of the benefits that were realized as the standardization. So this slide really sort of depicts what we were doing. We were moving from multiple instances of SAP migrating them to one common template, one instance upgraded to ECC 6, and utilizing the same processes and the same dimensions in each area. So we embarked on a migration process where we took the countries that were using SAP at the time and migrated them into this new instance, leaving behind the transactional data but pulling forward the master data opening balances and open items that we had in each of these various instances.
So this was all about standardization. Yeah.
Yes. We had to start with really agreeing to a common and standard organizational structure. So we had to harmonize every dimension, from company codes to profit centers, cost centers, chart of accounts, and other various dimensions that we've incorporated since then. We also standardized on how we track our projects, and our projects are our new releases. So say One Direction has a new release, they were assigned a unique project code that all countries would follow and use that same project definition, and this enables us now to track all of our costs associated with marketing and promotion and recording, and match that up against the sales of that product. So we can now provide a project P&L at various levels. We can go as high as that release, down to the individual products, down to the individual tracks in some cases, if we want to capture that level of detail. The common chart of accounts was a big exercise, and I'd say what had always enabled us to operate the way we did is we consolidate through Hyperion at the time. We're now moving into SAP BPC, but at the time we were using Hyperion, and that was sort of the mask that enabled all these various systems and processes to come together, because every country was mapping their local accounts to the Hyperion chart of accounts, and that's ultimately what we use to submit to Sony corporate each month. So we went through each of the processes, each of the business processes, like procure to pay, record to report, and reached an agreement with all of the countries ahead of time. And I'd say it was still fairly high level, and then as we embarked on the individual migrations, you got into more of the details, but at least conceptually we started out with the same agreement on the template and how this would work in the future.
It's no mean feat to get agreement and all that across different systems across the world.
Different cultures, historically operating in a different way, but I think, again, I think the state of the industry, the state of the company, and a lot of what the financial organizations were going through with, I'll say, outsourcing and the shared services, that started to bring alignment on the reasons why we had to do something like this, and we got people on board to cooperate and to participate at the right level that we needed them.
It's quite interesting because a lot of the common advice is always to get your processes right before you outsource. You outsource first, but it almost acts as a catalyst to help make people aware of how different things work. I would agree. I'm not sure we would have been able to get our processes right. I think we would have had a lot more resistance. So maybe we did it sort of in the reverse way, but it definitely helped, and it still works. We're seeing more efficiencies as a result. Okay, so this is what you were doing. So tell us a little bit about this timeline.
So we had, I feel, a pretty aggressive timeline. We started the project in 2012 once we got approval for the business case and approval for the investment. And for the first 6 to 9 months, we did all the blueprinting. We gathered people in various locations, did a lot of things remotely, but established the high-level template and agreed on the chart of accounts and agreed on the approach. And then we embarked on the migration process. So our fiscal year for Sony Music begins on April 1st. So that was always our target. And I think that also was very helpful in helping us manage the scope. So we always knew we had a target. We had to achieve an April 1st date. Otherwise, we had to do mid-year conversions, and nobody wanted to do that. And we reached an agreement that we wouldn't bring over historical transactional data, so that made it more important to start your year clean to start the fiscal year cleanly in a new environment. The first countries that we went live with were Germany, Switzerland, Austria. That entity operates as a sort of a shared service called GSA, primarily in Germany, but doing some of the financial accounting for Switzerland and Austria. They were a very challenging organization in that they had their instance of SAP had been around probably for close to 15 years and was heavily customized to meet their requirements and what they felt were efficiencies. But so by having them go first, this was one of our biggest and most challenging, but it was also significant in that if we could prove that we could bring Germany live, then it would help us get the other countries on board. So we did Germany first, went live with them in April of 2013. Then we embarked on the next set of European countries, which by migrating them would enable us to shut down the European instance. So with that implementation, and you can see where it was staggered, and again, this is one of the challenges we faced. As we were going live with Germany, we then had to position some of the project team members to start the next set of countries in Europe. So we brought in UK and Ireland, France, and Spain and Portugal, who were already using SAP at the time. Again, configured very differently from one another, but at least using SAP. And along the way, we picked up Italy. And Italy at the time was using a local system called Formula, but we brought them into SAP, and on April 1st, 2014, we went live with those 6 countries. Yeah, those 6 countries, which was a huge challenge, but we were successful. We had to spend a lot of time training Italy because they didn't know SAP, whereas the other countries did know SAP. It's just some of their processes were changing and their dimensions were changing. But we brought those 6 countries live in April 2014, and then again in 2014 started the migration for North America, which is the US and Canada, and which is also by far the largest entity. The US entity consists of all of the various music labels and just many different organizations within the US, and this represented our biggest opportunity to achieve the cost savings that we set out for. Also one of the more complex migrations because of the number of interfaces and the number of people and differences within the organization. But we went live with North America this past April 2015, and that really achieved what the original goals were. Since then, and actually once we completed GSA, we also brought in Czech and Hungary into SAP. So we started with 10 countries. We ended up with 13 countries, I think, at the time. And this really laid the platform for us to decide what to do going forward if we wanted to continue the implementation. I can touch on that further on.
That's a pretty aggressive timeline, so that's a great achievement. So tell us what you actually what you achieved, or the benefits you planned on, the benefits you got.
So as part of the business case, we needed to demonstrate some real savings that could justify the investment that we had to make. And by our estimates, we felt that we could save over $1 million a year out of IT, and this would be as a result of consolidating the 3 instances down to 1 instance, so we could save on the data center hosting. We also felt that we could shut down certain systems that were being run locally by replacing them with a standard system, whether it was SAP or another global system that we would use for all countries. And by reducing the number of instances and standardizing on common processes and common dimensions, we also felt that we could reduce the IT support, whether it was consulting or internal staff, because as an example, as I mentioned before, if we had to develop an interface for one country, a standard interface that was used by all countries rather, in the previous environment we might have to do that 10 different times. In the current environment, hopefully we only have to do that once, because everything being common should enable us to do that. So the projected savings for IT was about $1 million, and then it was harder to get a commitment on the operations, the finance operations, so they committed at the time that they could save $400,000 a year by standardizing and leveraging best practices. So those were more of the operating costs ongoing that we felt like we could achieve about $1.5 million. In addition to that, we also felt that, as that example I gave about having to sort of replicate the same interface change over and over again. We felt that going forward we would be able to save $1.5 million by not having to duplicate the efforts in so many ways. And then the other big thing was at the time we were on ECC 5. We knew we needed to do an upgrade, and that was going to require us to upgrade each of those separate instances, so to do the upgrade 3 times. And we felt that that was at least $1.5 million that we would have to incur. So by standardizing and doing the upgrade once, we were able to avoid that cost.
Now, normally when you look at business cases and benefit statements, they normally go one direction once you get to reality, but interesting to see what your achievements were here.
So we have achieved the IT savings of over $1.2 million. We have realized that, and it didn't just happen in one fell swoop. It happened gradually over time as the countries migrated to the standard instance, and we were able to get them off their current instances. So now that we've completed that, we have reduced our operating budget in IT by over $1 million. But surprisingly, we are achieving greater savings now on the finance operations, and I think this is just starting to be realized. Even though they have achieved this already, I think there will be further savings that they'll realize, and I think this is largely due to that what I explained before, where we have 2 centers of shared services through an offshore provider, one in Romania and one in India. But previously, in each of those locations, we had dedicated people that had to support various countries that they were responsible for. And so you had these teams that did the end-to-end process for Italy, for example, or Germany. Now that everyone is operating on the same platform, we're starting to see centers of excellence emerge where there's a procure-to-pay stream that cuts across all countries. And as a result of that, they're able to reduce the number of people in some of those teams and gain better savings. And now the provider is also coming back to us to find improvements and recommendations of things that we can change. So I think we've achieved the greater savings on the operating side for finance, and I think we'll continue to see that as we go forward and bring more countries in.
That's great. So it's both cost savings and cost avoidance, which is always important to remember. But it's not just about the money. So you had some other benefits here.
Yeah, I think one of the benefits was around the risk and the compliance. With some of the countries that were running local systems, over the years we tended to find issues with, again, compliance or risk fraud risk, and I think it was because they were operating locally with very little visibility. Now that we've centralized all of the countries, they're all operating in the same way, so they have to therefore follow the SOX compliance, even if some of the countries don't necessarily fall into the threshold for SOX within Sony Music. The U.S., certainly the larger countries do. So everybody's following a similar process for SOX, for SOD compliance, and it's also enabled us to, I'll say, simplify and potentially reduce our audit fees going forward, that because the processes are all the same, our external auditors can look across all the countries from one location and not have to necessarily do the individual audits that they used to do in the past, where if being that the user access, the ITGC controls are similar, they should be able to do it from one location. So I think there's a benefit around the risk reduction and the ongoing compliance. I did touch on the process standardization, and I think this is where the centers of excellence will continue to emerge, and the BPO operations will become more efficient, I think, as we continue to follow the standardization and bring more countries in.
I guess that standardization also gives you more flexibility as an organization. So you bring on a new country, or you start doing new things, then you've got a common process worldwide.
I think what we've seen, we've even brought in additional countries beyond the scope of what I've talked about so far, and for the most part we're able to absorb them without adding additional headcount. Now there'll be a threshold of how much we can absorb before we have to add more more headcount or shift the resources. But yeah, I think there's that benefit from the standardization. And then I kind of mentioned this earlier about the improved analytics. Now that we are operating with the common dimensions like the chart of accounts and using the same project identifier worldwide, this is putting us in a better position where we can look at our artists globally now, whereas in the past, for us to do that, we had to have everyone submit their own spreadsheet using their own project identifier, and it was very difficult to see this. Now we have all of that data harmonized in the same way within SAP, and we're using things like BW and different analytical tools that we use against BW to look at that information, and I think that puts us in a good position going forward as well.
That's a great reminder that when we talk about process standardization, it's what goes hand in hand with that is a data standardization, which allows you to have the improved analytics. That's great. Thanks, Dave. So, what have you learned from this whole journey, this process?
There's quite a few observations, and I think that the benefits that we've taken away, in no particular sequence, I'd say probably the biggest factor that has helped us be successful is the leadership from our senior management, from business leadership in particular. And I think we benefited tremendously. We had a finance director in Germany who was promoted to be the international finance director, and he had, I'm going to say, almost instant credibility because he operated, he knew what the individual country FDs were going through and the way that they worked and the way they operated, and so he had relationships with all of them. He got it. He understood what they had to go through, and now he was elevated to a position where he wanted the standardization. He wanted us to go forward with this initiative, and he was able to influence the individual FDs to get them on board. It kind of goes hand in hand with the statement about the mandates that they don't work here. Our culture had always been pretty liberal, and maybe it's reflective of the industry. And I also think it's a natural influence that people, they don't want to be told what to do. We need to get them on board, and I think we did that. I think, again, I have to say, this is a project that people, if you really ask them, they didn't want to do this. They were very comfortable with what they had for the most part. There were a couple countries in their SAP environment that their SAP was in shambles and they didn't understand it, so I think they were a little bit more eager to move forward. But many of the countries were very happy with what they had. They had invested, they had customized it, so they were comfortable. But nonetheless, we were able to get them on board, and I think really because of the leadership of our senior finance. I think that helped tremendously. I think some of the other lessons are the communications, the stakeholder management, getting the stakeholders on board, working with them to understand what the blackout periods are in each country, between month-end closings or holidays or summer vacations. We worked with them to say, tell us when you're available, tell us when you're not, and we worked around their schedules as much as we could. So our project manager, I really think, went over the top in communicating to everyone and understanding their concerns, their conflicts, let's say, and getting them on board. The April 1st deadline was very helpful in helping us to manage scope, so we had to find the right balance that we were going to replace what they had. We never wanted to take away anything from them, but we had to be careful about how much more we could promise beyond what the original scope was. So I think having a target like that was very helpful for us.
Right, thank you. So what's next on your roadmap? What's next on the journey?
So as I said, what we achieved in those 3 years accomplished the goals of getting the current SAP countries into a standard SAP environment, and then some, because we did pick up Italy, we did pick up Czech and Hungary. Since that time, and even along the way as we were doing the US, we've also pulled in a few other countries that were running local systems. So we've brought in Turkey, we've brought in Poland, we're about to bring Greece. Greece goes live next week, and now we're starting to tackle Russia. So we've picked up these kind of one-offs and now increased where we're up to 15 countries now, soon to be 16. but now really the big initiative is for us to bring in the regions that are outside of SAP today, and we're tackling Latin America right now. Our goal is to bring the 10 countries in our Latin America region live over the summer. We do know that we have a lot of complex tax and statutory requirements there that we're dealing with. The difference that we're seeing with Latin America, which is refreshing, is this is a region that desperately wants to get on SAP. They're currently running multiple versions of Navision, all configured very differently, and they've really outgrown them. So they're very anxious to come into SAP, which is, like I said, is very different. There's a very great level of cooperation and enthusiasm here, so we're looking forward to that. And then once we get through Latin, we'll continue to bring in the remaining countries, which would be Asia and some countries in Europe that are still on Microsoft Navision. But I think what's also changing now is the countries that we've brought on board are our biggest countries and represent our greatest revenues. So there's a high degree of risk there that we have to ensure that we operate efficiently, that we have uptime and performance is good. And the big thing is we don't want to now, I'll say, backslide into where we were before, having various custom processes. So we've implemented a governance process. We've been working on this for well over a year to engage the different process leads, representation from the major countries, and going forward, as we make, if we have an enhanced or we have a change request, to make sure that everybody's in agreement with it, so that we continue to maintain and implement standard processes. And then just one other point is, it kind of goes back to having all the largest countries and the biggest stakeholders, that we need to optimize the operating environment. We're continuing to bring in additional countries. With the number of interfaces we have, which at this point are in the hundreds, some of these interfaces are very high volume due to digital sales, both revenue, royalties, and different income streams. So we constantly have to keep an eye on our growth and making sure that the environments are optimal. So now we're embarking on the HANA trail. We're about to do a proof of concept, and the goal is to start moving some of our processes into HANA, and again, continuing to make sure that we're operating effectively and with a good performance.
Well, thank you for that, Dave. That's very insightful talk and great achievements you've made there over 3 years. So thanks for that. Let's just talk briefly about those lessons learned. Do keep asking your questions through the panel in the interface so we can get those. It's pretty clear that Sony Music have demonstrated leadership here in both their finance process and systems approach here, and this is consistent with what we're seeing around the world. The leaders are building this foundation of centralization, common system, and standardization, and certainly you've seen excellent financial savings here from Dave's narrative. And the predictable results, compliance, and organizations with a mission. I think all that comes out very clearly in Dave's story. So certainly echoing with what we see elsewhere, stakeholder management is right up there at the top, how to ensure that we get the right stakeholders engaged and sustained throughout what is quite a long process. And great examples here about finance leadership driving the change. I think it's interesting also to see improvements in processes, data, and controls going hand in hand, that standardization. And clearly it takes some perseverance. I think Dave might have aged more than 3 years in the past 3 years. But these new challenges that you referred to, really I kind of see those pretty consistent. It's now about continuous improvement and global process ownership, or what you call centers of excellence. So yeah, that's the challenge we now got to face, and I know a lot of organizations are facing that. So some thoughts for the road for you all. These new challenges, the continuous improvement and global process ownership. So if you want continuous improvement, certainly the evidence is you need some form of continuous monitoring. And for process ownership, we're talking about a new discipline here. We're talking cross-functional leadership, where you don't own the resources around the world. These are tough jobs to do. So to have some framework to allow you to drive that critical responses. So organizations are looking for those ways of addressing these things. When we talk about continuous improvement, standardization, and continuous monitoring, we all know that sadly what should happen, however well we standardize our processes, isn't really what is happening in all cases. And this is one of my favorite pictures. Any of you who've been on a webcast of ours, I always sneak this in somewhere. So I think it's pretty self-evident, that little parking barrier in the middle and the tire tracks in the snow. You know, we like to believe that everyone's going through the parking barrier, but we kind of know in our darkest moments that there's tire tracks. So we need to find out where those tire tracks are, understand what's causing them, and continue to refine our processes and our policies so we can make it as efficient and effective as possible. So this whole issue of these tire tracks, the exceptions to processes, you know, what's the impact of having difference between what should happen and what actually does happen? You know, there's a whole bunch of impacts, and fundamentally, when you're not standard, we suffer from lack of flexibility, cost impacts, performance impacts, and so on. So the continuous monitoring response to that is about having capabilities to look at both the configuration of systems and access to applications. Dave mentioned SOD as part of compliance. And also, these are the things that people can do, these control monitoring, and also look at what's actually happening in terms of transaction exceptions and data, which, you know, where you have examples of data not being sufficiently controlled. If we can monitor these things, then we can get very good visibility on the tire tracks in our processes, and we can take action and fix them on a continuous basis. And then we'd like to look at these through three different lenses: financial control and compliance, broader risk assurance, and process optimization. And as we'll talk later, these three things go hand in hand. Talking about the centers of excellence, you know, there's probably one of the biggest challenges right now as organizations move to this next stage is how do we do this global process ownership thing? Everyone's talking about it. A few people are doing it. Not so many people are doing it very well yet. We're still trying to learn. But this idea of managing the process today and also leading for tomorrow, this idea of process operator, process owner, and there's some interesting ideas that come through in books by John Cotter, which are going to help a lot of this about the dual operating system. So worth thinking about how do we help this particular issue about leading tomorrow in process ownership. So here's a schematic that helps you think about, well, what does the process ownership, the process owner and the process ownership community need to do? Well, we need to understand what's our world-class target, where do we want to get to, understand where we are currently, where our tire tracks in the snow are, and what tools we have, assess the gaps and opportunities, prioritize those as a community, take actions, implement change, and that's a continuous improvement process. But you need a mechanism to do it. And what we're seeing is organizations looking for a common framework, a common language, a way of getting the various stakeholders who don't all work in the same reporting line, getting them together to get agreement on key issues, key priorities, so everyone can work to, if you like, a governance model for the process itself, whether it's purchase to pay, record to report, or order to cash. So as we think about these thoughts to the road, if you're thinking about standardization, process standardization, or data standardization, as Dave commented, you might want to think about some mechanism of analyzing your process variance or process exceptions against what you expect, a way of building a case for action for the kind of standardization process that Dave's been through. This is one tool that can be very powerful. Doing the same thing, perhaps for your SAP controls environment, whether they be the access controls, whether it's configuration and process controls, making sure that we have a good set of process and security-based controls that allow us to run our processes the way we think we should be, and then being able to get an analysis of that. And then thirdly, this idea of process ownership, some kind of capability assessment based on a common framework, implement a common language, get stakeholders together, get agreement around the key facts, and at least start the process of continuous improvement around a common way of working. So one final thought, and I think there's some evidence from Dave's talk, and certainly we see elsewhere, that it's becoming increasingly apparent that better control and better performance are two sides of the same coin. If we take the right actions, we get results in both of those areas. They don't have to be at odds like we, in those days gone by, we thought these things were fighting against each other. So this is the topics we've covered. Thank you for your attention. Did say we take some questions. We are very tight on time. I will just lead with one, or finish with one question for Dave. All the others, we will come back to you separately. But I think it's a good question to finish on. Dave, if you had your time again, what would you do differently, apart from not come to work in the morning?
I would say what I would try to do differently would be to, I'll say, really staff this project adequately, and it's a tough one, because if we really went and said, this is what we really need to do this, it would have driven up our costs, it would have made it harder to get the justification. So we were blessed with what I just keep calling superheroes. We had the overall project manager, which is so dedicated and gave all his personal time to getting this done, and also having a very good partnership with our integrators and our overall team. So I think these were like superhero efforts that helped us get there. And maybe we needed to do that initially to get the credibility and get this off the ground. And as you saw, we've achieved every one of our milestones within our budget. And that has earned us credibility when we're going forward with these other 8 Latin implementations, these other country implementations. We're implementing BC. So I think we've earned credibility. But I think it was at the expense of a few people and their personal lives. But, and maybe most projects have something like that. So I think taking care of the people that are on the team, and that was something I might do differently. I think some of the other challenges are with that kind of timeline that we had. As much as we agreed on a common template, it did evolve over time. I wouldn't say it's different or very different than when we started and where we are now. But there are some things that we would do differently that you know in hindsight, but you didn't know back then.
Well, I guess if you had your time again and you could show them, you know what, these benefits can actually be bigger than we had.
Right.
That would require some Back to the Future kind of situation.
And we've talked about that. Do we go back and sort of adjust some of the things we did to bring them in line? But the template itself is held up. We haven't changed that dramatically. No. It's been more little tweaks in local processes.
Well, it's been a great privilege hearing about this experience, Dave. Thank you for your time. I'd like to thank you all for your time for joining us. I know we've run a few minutes over the allotted slot. We will get back to you on your questions. Thank you very much for your attention and for joining us. And good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are. Thank you very much indeed.